I'm curious, Dr. Cooper, why are so many doctors still holding to the calories in, calories out?
I have to assume that it's got to be the bias. It's got to be the bias that's in the way. The weight bias, the fat shaming, the righteousness of people who don't have these struggles. And what else could it be? Because the science has been staring us in the face. I was able to look back. I would say there was hard evidence that there's more of a neuroendocrine type of problem that's going on in these situations, I think going all the way back to the 1920s. For them to be able to see that without the technology we have today, it's shameful that we would still have people walking around clinging to this outdated perspective.
This is Fat Science, a podcast dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice.
I'm Dr. Emily Cooper. I've been treating patients with metabolic issues for over 25 years. I'm on a mission to raise awareness about metabolic dysfunction and why diets don't work.
Hi, I'm Andrea Taylor. I've been fat, very fat, chubby, morbidly obese, and done almost every diet ever invented. They all worked until they didn't. I've known Dr. Cooper forever, but when I became her patient and we learned metabolism was the real problem, wow, everything changed, and I've never been healthier.
And I'm Mark Wright. It's time for Fat Science.
Wait, does this podcast make me look fat?
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, on the show this week, letting go of calories in, calories out. Oh, this is such an inflammatory title, is it not?
Let it go, let it go.
Essentially, what we're going to be talking about is the evolution of thought when it comes to metabolic syndrome. And I'd like to start. That sounds a little dry and boring, but it all comes back to what do we actually know and what do we actually believe about what causes obesity and what causes metabolic syndrome. So I want to go back in time. You two have known each other since you were literally toddlers, and that would have been a fun conversation to be able to hear. The two of you discussing cookies or something that Andrea's mom had made. But I want to go back to, there was a point in history, in your history of your friendship, where Andrea was sought out by Dr. Cooper because Dr. Cooper was getting really pissed off about this whole conversation of, was metabolic syndrome a thing? Was it not a thing? I want the two of you to take me back in time to what was the problem, what was the solution, and how did the two of you solve it?
Well, we never solved it, really, but she was very angry. We were having conversations because she was working on a presentation, and she started telling me what the presentation was, and I was like, oh my God, this is really interesting. And you didn't tell me you were working on something like this. I thought you were working with anorexic patients. She's like, well, I am, but I'm also working on this. I was like, that's about fat people like me. And I was like, I want in. And I said, but you seem very angry at the medical establishment, all this. I said, and nobody wants to hear an angry doctor. Yeah. I said, no one's going to listen to you.
Yes,
because
we're right.
Because it's too angry. I said, we got to figure out a way that you can sound really, like the message can be positive, but the anger is still there, but you can sound positive because you have something very positive to say, but you can't just, nobody wants to hear just anger. It doesn't resonate. So somehow we got to turn it around.
That's interesting. There was a legitimate reason for the anger, Dr. Cooper, because you were ridiculed literally laughed at and yelled at and sworn at by
Yeah.
people in the medical establishment
Definitely.
in the beginning of your journey. So take us back, Dr. Cooper, and let us know what some of those exchanges were that led to that, just that righteous anger that you had.
It still like bubbles up in me. I can feel it because it really was so stressful because it started, I think I contacted Andrea in like 2012. And the reason was I was literally realizing that I was just making things worse by trying to communicate what to me was fascinating science and had held the answers. I know it sounds crazy, like we have the answers, but science holds the answers.
You had the answers.
And history held the answers. And there was some amazing stuff. And it's true, Andrea said, I was working on various different educational pieces and things, and I came across like a lot of really interesting science. And what really happened was I was working with patients with eating disorders like anorexia, and I started to notice things in their physiology that made me more and more interested in metabolism as they were recovering. And these were things that had to do with these familiar hormones that we talk about, leptin and neuropeptide Y and agouti-related peptide and ghrelin and amylin, like a lot of these hormones. And so I was learning more and more about that, and then started to have some of my other patients or people referred to me for, I had a reputation for being able to test people's like exercise physiology status and help them get into programs that improved their cardiovascular fitness and their what's called VO2 max, which is aerobic fitness. So I would get some referrals from doctors to have patients get into these programs. And so we did metabolic testing to figure out how they should exercise. And during their metabolic testing, I saw the same exact things that I was seeing in the patients with anorexia. And so they may have been referred to me because they had a higher body weight. And so their doctor thought, oh, they need to get an exercise program. Then I would do the testing and see, wait a minute, they have signs of metabolic restraint, like their metabolism is being pulled back. And you could see it in this metabolic testing that we do with gas exchange. And so then I went on to check their lab work, and I found their lab work was the same as people who were literally starving in some of these hormone balances. So their body was in a state of elevated famine signals and very weak what we call security signals that would say we're not in a famine. So there was a big imbalance there that I previously thought was something you would see in people who are malnourished. And when I say malnourished, it's not that these people weren't malnourished, but malnourished to the extent of being like significantly underweight and having to rebuild that weight back up. And so seeing that similarity, it just totally made a light bulb go off, and everything made sense at that point. That's when this was actually way back. It was probably 1999 or 2000 when I started noticing this. And that's when I ditched all what I had been doing with people, telling them, oh, you should exercise this way and eat that way. And because I measured all their metabolic expenditure and saw that they're burning this much when they do that. And it should just be a calorie in, calorie out game. And so I started implementing these big, extensive worksheets and workbooks in Excel and having them track everything. And it was crazy. I did that for a while. And then when I started seeing more and more the similarity of them to the patients with anorexia, and them when they tried to go on those deficit things, they developed those physiologic markers too, and their metabolism was slowing down. So what looked like it was, quote, working in the short term started to really backfire. And these were very reliable people. They were telling me what they're doing. They were really gung-ho, let's be part of this and try to see if we can solve this. So then I totally ditched that mentality and dug deeper and deeper into the science of metabolism and found, as I say, it holds the answers. And it's really about metabolic function. It's a very complex system that is basically a neuroendocrine system. So it's your nervous system and your endocrine system working together to send messages about your status. And so I was so excited, I tried to share all this information with people. So when doctors would send me these patients, I would tell them, oh, you sent me this patient to go on an exercise program, but they shouldn't be exercising actually, because their body, it thinks they're starving and they actually need to go off that diet, and they would get so mad at me. Some of the doctors would yell at me and hang up on me. And it was tough. And then before I called Andrea, I had a couple of really bad encounters. And I actually went to a coach first before I called Andrea. I went to a coach to help me communicate better, but it didn't help. And it led to more issues where I actually went out to an event with a couple of healthcare professionals. And during that event, there was a very contentious argument that went on. Like, one of them said, we don't know why bariatric surgery works for some people and not others. And I said, did you do any kind of lab work or anything before you took them into surgery to find out what the actual problem was? No, we don't need any lab work. It's pretty much implying it's always that they're just eating too much and they just need to eat less and don't have the willpower or something.
Okay, I'm not a doctor, but this is shocking. This is shocking because you've told us that we now know that some of these amazing hormones are created by the stomach. So when you take some of the stomach out, it profoundly affects the production of certain hormones. And for them to say we don't need to know what the hormone levels are, that just makes my hair stand on end.
And that was back in like 2012 or 2010 or something, like 2011, somewhere in there. And I already was able to measure ghrelin levels in our patients and all of those things. And so then the other person that was there said, who was also a healthcare professional, said some patients are so desperate to eat, they'll just eat food that's not defrosted yet, or they'll eat food out of the garbage. And obviously that's a psychological problem, she said, and that they need therapy or something for that. And so then I just started I said, you didn't look at any lab? How do you know what the labs are doing? I mean, if this is really happening, they have a serious metabolic problem. And there's a reason for it, a biochemical reason, not a psychological reason. And so anyway, that whole conversation was really uncomfortable. And it was actually that next day I called Andrea.
So take me back to that conversation. What did you say?
I said, Andrea, you have to help me. And the reason was because Andrea is an expert in messaging. And actually, I think I was complaining to like my sister who has had a friendship and has a friendship with Andrea, and said, you should talk to Andrea. She's like an expert in this. And I thought, yes, I forgot. And let me call Andrea. She'll know the answer to this. And because Andrea is very good at messaging and marketing and communications.
At the time, I did marketing for cable networks, a lot of different cable networks. I've worked in doing all their marketing and design and stuff like that.
And you really have a knack for that. And so I called Andrea and I told her, I went on and on, as I can do, and I was just very like, you can't believe what's happening.
Right. Obviously, the subject matter was interesting to me.
Yeah.
Because it affected me personally. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
What?
And
oh, my God. Because I didn't know all the information. Because I was obviously on the receiving end of the other side of the information. I was like, really? I could be starving? What?
Yeah.
So that was interesting to me. And then I was like, okay, but you can't talk about it in an angry way. You have to talk about it in, like, you have to be the friendly, informative. And one of your key phrases is going to be contrary to popular.
Yes, you taught me that.
What was it? Contrary to popular
beliefs.
Yep.
Or as counterintuitive
you're going to
seems.
You're going to be the counterintuitive person because
Right.
everybody thinks calories in, calories out.
Right.
And you're going to be the one up there saying, hey, this isn't true. And it hasn't been true for what, like 150 years or whatever?
Yeah.
I said, and you're going to have to be like the one taking the slings and arrows. But you're going to use science as your facts, and science are going to be your shield.
Yeah.
And you have to use it as your shield, and you have to stay normal and smile and Never get to that level. Never go into it. Never get mad. And just say, these are facts. I'm not
Yes.
arguing with you because this isn't something to argue about. These are scientific facts. And you can have an opinion. Everybody has one. But this isn't an opinion. I'm not giving you a medical opinion. These are scientific facts. And we've known about them for hundreds of years. Why they're not out there in the way that you want to understand them. There's a thing called big business and people making money. That's sort of what's happened over the years, and things have changed and opinions, but these are scientific facts, and here they are. And let me tell you some interesting cases and present them as, here's some interesting information. Oh my God, you should hear this. It's amazing. It's incredible. Oh my
Right.
God. And like, you have to present it like that, and stories that people want to hear at a cocktail party and that they can hear in a quick snippet and tell somebody so that they feel smart. Not you feel smart.
Right.
They feel smart. Put the information out in the quickest, shortest way. And that's the only way that you can spread the gospel. And it's super duper hard because, as I've learned from Dr. Cooper, I have to do it too now, because as I became a patient, people would say, who is that voodoo doctor that you're going to? What are these drugs? Because I started on all these GLP drugs, as you did too, Mark. We started on these drugs when nobody ever heard of them. And even my doctors that I went to were like, what is this drug? What? And they're like, it's working, so I guess it's fine. And I would have to explain why it was working and what metabolic syndrome was. And as we went along, the world followed up into your thing. And then they were like, oh, science. Yeah, science.
I'm curious, Dr. Cooper, why so many doctors were so resistant to the idea that it's not just about calories in, calories out. Because we look at the human body like it's a car, and you just put gas in and it gets burned off.
Right.
But you were talking about leptin, which is the body's signal that we have a certain amount of fat, we have enough fat. So if your leptin levels are low, your body's going to say, we need more fat.
Right.
And so it's going to store more fat. So it slows down your metabolism, and that those calories that you ate don't get burned off. They get stored into your body as fat. And so that dynamic of leptin and ghrelin, the hunger hormone, how come more doctors didn't just say, that's interesting, let's look into that? They're just like, I guess if we look back over history, if you look at alcoholism, if you look at mental illness, if you look at obesity, it's all been boiled down to, oh, that's just a moral weakness that we have as human beings. And then there's massive judgment. But I'm curious, Dr. Cooper, why are so many doctors still holding to the calories in, calories out?
I've thought about that for so many years, and I've seen that play out. For example, years and years ago, I was at a conference, and this question came up from an audience person, said, why is it that some of my patients are reporting that they're eating X amount, and yet they're gaining weight? And the respondent said, oh, they're underreporting their food and they're overreporting their exercise. And that was it. And so I tried to stand up and say, aren't you curious to find out if it's something else? That's a very convenient cop-out answer. But there's other reasons for this that we should be looking at. Aren't people curious about this? Or are you just discounting it just because it's convenient and it's biased? And so I have to assume that it's got to be the bias. It's got to be the bias that's in the way. The weight bias, the fat shaming, the righteousness of people who don't have these struggles. And what else could it be? Because the science has been staring us in the face. I was able to look back. I would say there was hard evidence that there's more of a neuroendocrine type of problem that's going on in these situations, I think going all the way back to the 1920s. So may have even been before that, but I could see that the thought processes of scientists and researchers and doctors at the time that were reporting these things and publishing very good scientific papers were recognizing this in the 1920s. And for them to be able to see that without the technology we have today, it's shameful that we would still have people walking around clinging to this outdated perspective.
I do think that a lot of it is you see somebody who has excess weight and you're like, oh, it's because they eat too much. And even now, the whole processed food thing, I think that whole thing is a lot of, oh, we see them eat, they're all going to fast food. They're all eating too many hamburgers. It goes to the same thing. It's, oh, we can get research money for that because they're all just doing fast food and they're feeding their kids the $3 menu. So that's why all the kids are too fat. I do think that is a lot of the quick thinking. It's like a quick, easy fix. And it's a way that you can blame the patient as opposed to taking the time and looking for something else. It's like looking at the quick symptom as opposed to looking at the cause.
Oh, and they also blame parents too.
Oh,
There's been talk
easy.
of taking kids away from parents because of
Take away the tacos, and then the kids will be fine.
But one example I have of this is I had a very nice relationship with an endocrinologist in the community, and she was wonderful. And so she was one person that was listening that I could talk to that thought it was really interesting and, never discounted what I was trying to convey about patients that we shared. And so one day she said, let me come on over there and see, this information. Because I said, you've got to see some of these cases. Because I've always been tracking our data, our patient data and things. And again, this was way long ago. This was before our discussion, Andrea. But she came over and I was showing her, I believe it was like in 2005 or 2006, I was showing her these articles that were published about leptin and its influence on the reproductive system and its influence throughout the body and what happens with like calorie restriction and all that. And I had been measuring leptin in our patients and we had been seeing these things. So she came on over and she was looking at the data and looking at the articles. And she said to me, she turned to me, she said, she's Harvard trained. She said, this was published by one of my professors when I was in training. And they didn't teach us any of this in my training program. That's what she said.
Oh my gosh.
So she just was like, this is crazy. Like why they didn't tell us any of this information, which would be so helpful. So I think that's also part of the disconnect is the research. There's such a huge gap in the research, the scientific research and the clinical application. Huge gap. But I also think that I used to think that clinicians were the ones who weren't keeping up with the science. And so I would gravitate to talking to scientists a lot. But the problem with the scientists is they have no clinical experience. They cling to their research data as if it's the way of it's hard evidence, their research data. But research subjects and research studies really are different than clinical real life because the subjects are not controlled in every way. In real life, people have their life of what's happening, all these different things that are going on. They have different medical backgrounds. They have different problems going on. And they have different access to medication. They go on vacation. So it's not the same. And also, it's over a longer period when you do clinical medicine. You're seeing people over many years if they're your same patients. I have some patients I've seen for 16 years. So this is a longer relationship. And in research, there may be a 12-week study, a 16-week study, and it's all the same kind of people because otherwise they'd have to use so many numbers of people. So one of the problems that I did encounter was in trying to talk to the scientists, the research scientists, they really had no insight in what happens clinically in a real live patient. And so they would cling to this concept that if you just manipulate this or that, their body will respond X way. But they didn't have a concept of the multidimensional aspect of metabolism, that they didn't really know much about the hormones that regulate metabolism. In my career, I've contacted the experts in the world. That's who I contact when I have a question or when I want to share some information. And I learned that technique because when I first was out of residency, I wanted to practice rural medicine. So I was in the middle of nowhere in North Dakota. And when you're in there, you could contact anyone you want. So might as well contact the person who knows the most in the world because nobody's nearby. So I learned that strategy there. But I still always do. And so I contacted this expert who was in the field of, he specialized in the receptors in the brain. They're called the melanocortin receptors. And I was trying to tell him that this one medication that didn't perform well in the clinical trials was like amazing for certain people who had a certain problem that affected that pathway. And for everyone else, it didn't work at all. And so I'm trying to explain this to him and about the why, because there's something that influenced those receptors he was an expert in, but he told me he doesn't know anything about that part of the pathway. He only knows further down those receptors. So to him, he didn't see why the medicine wouldn't work for everyone because he didn't follow what I was trying to say. So then I started realizing, oh my gosh, some of these experts are so high up, but they really only know about one little tiny piece of the whole puzzle. I took that on a little bit in my career. Not that I'm not trying to say I'm great at this, but I had to, out of necessity, start to look for the whole big picture of what is going on and put these pieces together from a little bit here, a little bit there, from my conversations with experts in these little specific areas and try to come up with something that could be translated into a clinical strategy. Based on that, then I was excited to share some of this information, and that's when I was often shot down early on. And it's true, when I talked to Andrea that time, I was pretty emotional too. I was really angry and sad. And Andrea's very kind, but I did go on a long time and I was angry, and that was the first thing she said is, no one wants to hear an angry doctor. And I took that to heart. She was right. She actually helped me. She wrote down reams of paper of ways I could say things. She said, what is it you're trying to say? And I would tell her, and then she'd say, what if you say it like this? And then it was like reams, like hundreds of different phrases and things. And she said, try this out with your patients and see if it works. And I started doing it. It brought me instant happiness. It really did. It changed everything because I no longer felt like when you're desperate to get this point across and you feel like anxious about it, that nobody's listening, they tune you out. And so doing it the way Andrea said, it started working immediately. People were actually responding like, oh, really? Oh, and that was just my patients, and that was easy. Then some of them, I told them, I'm practicing this. And then after that, I started using it on outside people, the practitioners and clinicians, and it was working there too. I am so grateful for Andrea to teach me that. I see it as a whole different language, and I might need to brush up on it because I'm feeling a little angry again.
Yeah, we all do sometimes.
But yeah.
I really think that strategy is beautiful. And one of the things that I really love about the way that you communicate now, Dr. Cooper, is that you'll say phrases like, what we tell our patients is this, or
Right.
what we've seen in our
Yeah.
patients is this.
Right.
And you're not telling people what to do,
No.
but you're stating the fact in a way that's not threatening. But the thing that I struggle with, Dr. Cooper, and I'd love some advice from you or Andrea, that when I engage with even friends on this topic, for some reason, everyday people think that they are experts in metabolism. That I'm on the no-carb diet and I lost X number of pounds. I'm on the all-meat diet. I lost X number of pounds. And people just are not willing to engage on the science. And they think that the study that they saw on Instagram is just as valid as the study that was in the Lancet or Harvard Medical Review or something like that. So I'd love some advice. I guess I know what the advice is. It's to not try to change people's minds by forcing it on them.
I don't think we can ever change somebody's mind because when they go on these crazy diets, they're really into it. And sometimes it's just so frustrating to hear, especially if you like if you like the person, it's really hard, because I have a lot of friends who do crazy diets all the time. And I mean all the time. They're always trying to lose weight. And sometimes what I'll say to them is, you've done this diet before. And I know we've had this discussion before. And yeah, it's going to work. And you're going to look great. And I guess you're going to feel great when you lose the weight. But just remember that you did it before and you gained the weight before. So it's what Dr. Cooper said to me when I told her about the 38 or 36 or whatever it was diets that I had done. And I was like, but I've done all the diets and they did work. And she said, then why are you here? And I was like, at the time, I think I weighed 375 pounds or something. And she goes, they all worked until they didn't. And I sometimes say to them, the diets work, but then they don't. You're just going to do it again. So think about that. And I said, don't use me as an example, use me as an example. Ever since I started doing what I've been doing with Dr. Cooper, I haven't been on a diet. I haven't restricted anything. I don't think about restricting anything. You know I eat dessert every meal. You know I eat all the time. And I haven't been in the panic that you're in every single day when you're like, oh my God, I can't eat that. Oh my God, I can't eat that. It doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
So think about that.
Dr. Cooper, any advice? And I should tell you, when I love having coffees with friends and talking about business ideas and stuff like that, but I'll tell you, so many times lately, I'll come up to someone that I haven't seen in a while, a friend, and they're like, oh my gosh, you look good. You look so
great.
Healthy. I can see it in your eyes. And it's like, that's my Dr. Cooper.
Mm-hmm. That's what I say.
I feel healthy and I look healthy because I am healthy. And it's not a belief in something. It's the labs that we do and the treatment that I'm on that has allowed this level of health and energy.
Don't you always say, I didn't do it for the pant size. I didn't do it to look better. I did it to be healthy.
And the first thing that they say when I say I have a metabolism doctor, oh, did she tell you to eat better and exercise more? And I said, no, she didn't.
No.
In fact, I couldn't exercise
I eat more
for 2 years.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
And I always tell them I eat more.
Yeah. True.
I always love to tell them. I love to tell people that.
And I bet they don't believe you.
No, they don't, but because they're like, you eat less when we're together. I'm like,
I think you're underreporting.
That's what they always say. They go, but you eat less when we're together. I go, yeah, but when I go home, I eat again.
I think this has just been a fantastic conversation because there has been an evolution of thought, especially in the medical community. And I think now, just among the general public, the fact that we're seeing this tidal wave of people who want these GLP-1 drugs because they are so transformative.
But I just wish they would not be called weight loss drugs.
Yeah.
I just harp on that all the time. I wish they would be called metabolic drugs. And I know, Dr. Cooper, you feel the same way too. Yeah. It's just I wish they would be called metabolic drugs and people would talk about that more. Mm-hmm. Like just the other day, there was a whole, even though I get so mad at her, Oprah was talking about how they reduced all the food noise, which they do, and I'm not saying that they don't, but that's what she was harping on, how not having that food noise and all that stuff has changed her life, which definitely, that they definitely do that, but that's not the main thing.
No. And it's like getting back to the calorie in, calorie out whole craziness. It is true that the energy in, we can really measure that because like this food has this many calorie value. But what is not so static is how you burn that fuel, how you burn it. That is so dynamic and it's based on that neuroendocrine signaling. And so that is not static, that you're just going to automatically, based on a formula, burn X amount of calories every day. And the other thing is the work that gets done in our body costs energy. And so if those hormones are in a position where it's saying, oh, we're in a famine or we're not secure, things will turn off. Like your reproductive function gets weaker, your thyroid function gets weaker. And so a lot of things, your body temperature even can go down to conserve energy. And so it costs less to operate your body. And that's called biologic adaptation or metabolic adaptation that happens. It's diet-induced biologic adaptation. So if you measure your metabolic rate before you start some type of calorie restriction, and then you start restricting those calories, your metabolism adapts to that lower calorie intake. And so now your metabolic rate is lower. So in order to keep playing that game, you would have to continue to lower and lower your calories. But there's no weight change that's going to ever happen that way long term. And in fact, as Andrea was saying, when you put that weight back on, as her friend goes on these multiple diets, that's dangerous because that's called weight cycling, and it leads to increase in visceral fat, increase in cardiovascular risk. And especially for people who are close to normal weights that do this, it's even thought to be more dangerous. So anyway, these are just ideas and thoughts about the flaws in the calorie in, calorie out. And I'm always wondering, like, how far have we come as a society to be able to let go of that mythology or that flawed messaging? So that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and the science is clear. Patients that you've had who are triathletes, who are eating very few calories in a day and still gaining weight is absolute proof that it's not calories in, calories out, that they were eating so few calories and exercising so hard in a day, and yet their body was in a famine mode, so it stored the calories. Mm-hmm. And it's just so crazy to think that it's just not as simple as we think it is. But I think we have come a long way. And I think, Dr. Cooper, you are really a great example of someone in the medical community who has persisted in a positive way. And you're not an angry doctor anymore.
Good.
And we're glad about that.
I feel like there should be a big sign that just says, it's the metabolism. It's the metabolism. Just think about it. I went to so many doctors, and seriously, nobody ever measured any blood, any leptin, nothing. No blood tests were ever done. So I feel like every time anyone wants to deal with their, like all your blood work should be looked at so that you can figure out what's the real cause. It's not the food, it's the metabolism.
We should have T-shirts that say that.
It's the metabolism, baby.
It's the metabolism. And calories in, calories out, let it go.
Let it go. Let it go. Bye-bye.
Well, this has been great. Such a great conversation. Thanks to you two for another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.
I'm Mark Wright. Thanks for listening to Fat Science with Dr. Emily Cooper. New episodes drop every Monday. If you've enjoyed the conversation, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. This production is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. Join us next week for another episode dedicated to the science of why we get fat. No diets, no agendas, just science that makes you feel better.